Hi, welcome to Did the DONuT experiment discover the tau neutrino? Part 2. This is the second video in a two-part series. In Part 1, we gave the case for saying that DONuT did discover the tau neutrino. They were the first experiment to directly observe it, meaning that they were the first to see it interact with a particle detector. Here in Part 2, we'll argue that they didn't discover the tau neutrino. This is because we pretty much already knew that it existed. If you haven't watched Part 1 yet, we'd strongly recommend you do that before continuing here. So here we're going to argue that direct observation of the tau neutrino by a particle detector was not actually necessary to know that it existed. And this is because other indirect experimental results had essentially already nailed it down. There are several references for this video. The references for the DONuT, E531, Chorus, and NOMAD experiments discussed in Part 1 can be found in Part 1 and in the video description below. Next, we have a reference to a paper that goes through a lot of the history of the experiments relevant to establishing the existence of the new tau. And also there are a few other experimental references that you can find in the video description. There are also a few other videos on this channel which may be helpful in understanding what we're talking about here. The measurement of the lifetime of the tau lepton was important for indirectly establishing the existence of the tau neutrino. So you might want to check out the video How the Measured Lifetime of the Tau Lepton Changed Over 30 Years, available on this channel. Also, long before DONuT, it was experimentally established that there were 3 light neutrino species. For more information on that, you can check out the video How Can the Measured Number of Neutrino Species Be 2.9963 plus or minus 0.0074? And lastly, we'll talk briefly at the end about how DONuT's result didn't meet the 5 sigma discovery criterion usually used in particle physics and whether or not that's important. For more information on that, you might want to check out the Understanding 5 Sigma playlist. Okay, let's start with a brief review of what we need from Part 1. So the first thing that we need to know is that neutrinos, of all types, interact with matter very weakly. This means they almost don't interact with a particle detector. Instead, they escape the detector invisibly. We know about them because they carry off missing energy and momentum. But neutrinos do, in fact, interact with matter, just very rarely. So it is possible to detect them. It's just very challenging. So DONuT saw evidence of a particle that could invisibly traverse shielding and then produce a tau lepton. Its interactions were compatible with those of a standard model tau neutrino. DONuT was the first experiment to produce tau neutrinos and see those neutrinos subsequently interact in a detector to produce tau leptons. This is what we mean when we say that this was the first direct observation of the new tau. But electron and muon neutrinos could also traverse the shielding. So DONuT needed to know that nu E and nu mu couldn't produce taus, at least at a rate that explained their observations. In the standard model, muon and electron neutrinos won't produce taus, but they needed experimental results confirming that this was the case. For this, they needed the results of other experiments. DONuT cited the results from the Chorus and NOMAD experiments, who constrained the interactions of electron and muon neutrinos with tau leptons to be too small to explain the DONuT results. So the situation was as follows. DONuT established that an invisible particle interacted with the tau lepton. But NOMAD, Chorus, and the earlier E531 experiment established that the previously known invisible particles, the electron and muon neutrinos, were not the particle that DONuT saw. So here we're going to ask, Before DONuT, did we know that an invisible particle interacted with the tau? And the answer to this question is yes. So in order to understand this, let's first look at the tau lepton and how it decays. The tau lepton was discovered in the 1970s. For more info on that, you can check out the video Discovery of the Tau Lepton. It was immediately observed to decay. In fact, those decays were predicted and used in the search for the tau. Let's take a look at how it decays. So here is a diagram for the decay of a tau lepton in the standard model. Let's read this from left to right. A tau lepton emits a W boson and turns into a tau neutrino. The W then disintegrates. It can disintegrate into an electron and electron antineutrino, a muon and muon antineutrino, or a quark antiquark pair. So this means the tau can decay into final states that include an electron, a muon, or hadrons. But the important point is that all of these decays contain a tau neutrino. And all of these decays had been experimentally observed before DONuT. The tau neutrino is essentially invisible, but it carries off energy and momentum. As we don't see it, this manifests as what looks like missing energy and momentum in the decay of the tau lepton. In the final states where there is an electron or muon, there is also an electron or muon antineutrino. So one might worry that we can't tell there are two invisible particles and not just one. But the energy spectrum of the electron or muon makes clear that there are two invisible particles in the decay. One can also look at a hadronic decay, like tau goes to tau neutrino plus pion. Here the tau neutrino is the only neutrino in the decay. But the main point is there are multiple decay modes and missing energy and momentum are observed in all of them. So unless you're willing to give up energy conservation, there was something invisible being produced in tau decays. And giving up energy conservation is something particle physicists would consider an absolute last resort. So the reasonable conclusion is that there was an invisible particle being produced in tau decays, just as would be expected if the tau neutrino existed. But did this invisible particle act like a new tau? The fact that tau decays produce an invisible particle is not the only information we can get from them. So we can ask more generally, how do we test that this process, as predicted by the standard model, is actually how a tau decays? Well, first, if we add up all of the ways the tau can decay, we can calculate the tau lepton lifetime. Also, we can ask what fraction of the time it decays to each possible final state. For example, how often does it decay to the final state that contains an electron? There is a similar process where a muon decays to a muon neutrino, an electron, and an electron antineutrino. In the standard model, this decay is mediated by the same physics as tau decay. Furthermore, the muon lifetime is very precisely known. So the idea is to compare the muon lifetime to the tau lifetime and see if the same underlying physics is at work. There are two issues here. The first is that the lifetime of the muon or tau depends on its mass, and the muon and tau have different masses. But we know how to correct for this. The other is that the tau can decay to multiple final states, while the muon, for all practical purposes, only decays to the state containing an electron. This is simply because the tau is heavier, so there are more sets of particles it can decay to. The solution is to calculate this quantity, which is the tau lifetime divided by the branching ratio of the tau to the final state that includes an electron. The branching ratio is just the fraction of tau decays that go to this state. This gives what the tau lifetime would be if it only decayed to the final state that contains an electron. Measurements of the tau lifetime and branching ratios began soon after it was discovered. By the time of DONuT's 2001 paper, these results were dominated by those of the Phys.Lett.B experiments, Aleph, Delphi, L3, and Opal. Phys.Lett.B was an E plus E minus collider in the same tunnel that now houses LHC. These experiments combined produced of order 1,000,000 tau leptons, allowing precise measurements of the lifetime and branching fractions. The particle data group, cited in the video description below, gave world averages for these quantities in 2000 that gave results compatible with what we expect from the standard model and muon decay. Also, tau decays were not the only source of information that we had about tau neutrinos. The Phys.Lett.B experiments also gave precise results looking at the decays of W bosons. To see this, we can take the interaction we saw earlier in tau decay and look at it another way. This diagram, which comes from the same interaction, when read from left to right, describes the decay of a negatively charged W boson to a tau and a tau antineutrino. The Phys.Lett.B experiments produced of order 10,000 W bosons in the 1990s and measured their properties. In the standard model, the W- decays to each of the 3 leptons and its associated antineutrino. The rates for these processes are essentially the same. The measured rates for a W decaying to each of the 3 types of leptons and something invisible agreed within uncertainties, indicating that the tau and its neutrino coupled to the W in the same way as the electron and muon and their respective neutrinos did. So, by the time DONuT published their initial result in 2001, we had long known that the tau decayed producing an invisible particle, which wasn't directly detected, but we knew it was there due to the energy and momentum it carried off, and that the tau decayed to states containing an electron or a muon or hadrons as predicted by the standard model interaction. We also knew that the value of the tau lifetime divided by its branching ratio to the final state containing an electron agreed with the value predicted by the standard model from muon decay. We also knew that the W decayed to a tau lepton and an invisible particle at a rate compatible with the standard model tau neutrino W interaction. So this was an even more direct probe of tau interactions than tau decay. So we knew that the tau interacted with an invisible particle whose behavior was indistinguishable from that of the standard model tau neutrino. Then the question to ask is, could this be one of the already known invisible particles, namely a nu E or nu mu? Because in order to conclude that a new particle had been discovered, we needed to be sure that what we're seeing isn't actually one of the already known particles. This was the same question that DONuT had to ask. Both DONuT and the previous experiments knew they had an invisible particle associated with a tau lepton, but this alone didn't imply a new particle. When DONuT published their results, they cited the results of NOMAD and Chorus, which had come out in 2000. The NOMAD and Chorus results showed only a small fraction of observed DONuT events could possibly come from non-standard interactions of the electron or muon neutrinos. But NOMAD and Chorus were not actually the first experiments to set these limits. Bubble chamber experiments at CERN and Fermilab looked for taus produced by electron and muon neutrinos and set early limits on the interactions between the tau lepton and the two non-tau neutrinos. But the first experiment to set meaningful limits was E531 at Fermilab. Like both the previous experiments and the subsequent NOMAD and Chorus experiments, E531 used neutrino beams that contained muon and electron neutrinos. They had these beams hit a target and they looked for production of tau leptons. They saw no evidence of tau production and set limits on the coupling strength of electron and muon neutrinos to the tau lepton. E531 published in 1986, just as new measurements of the tau lifetime and the branching ratio of a tau to an electronic final state were becoming available from tau decays. Those tau decay results were in line with the standard model prediction, and the decays clearly contained an invisible particle coupling to the tau. E531 showed that that invisible particle wasn't an electron or muon neutrino. Or, as E531 put it in the abstract of their 1986 paper, the direct coupling limits are also used to show that most tau decays must contain a neutral lepton other than nu mu or nu e. So, arguably, E531 established the existence of the tau neutrino 15 years before DONuT published. Okay, so we said before that, long before DONuT, we knew that the tau interacted with an invisible particle whose behavior was indistinguishable from that of the standard model tau neutrino. And we also knew that that invisible particle was not nu e or nu mu. Even that isn't the end of the story. We also knew how many light standard model-like neutrinos there were from the invisible width of the Z boson. This was first measured by the Phys.Lett.B experiments in 1989 and very strongly implied the existence of 3 standard model neutrinos. For more information and references, check out the video, How Can the Measured Number of Neutrino Species Be 2.9963 plus or minus 0.0074. Now, strictly speaking, this latter result didn't imply the existence of a tau neutrino. There could have been some other unknown neutrino, but it was a strong piece of circumstantial evidence. So, before DONuT, we knew the tau lepton interacted with an invisible particle whose behavior was indistinguishable from that of a nu tau. We knew that it wasn't nu e or nu mu, and we knew there were 3 light neutrinos. So, what did DONuT do? Before, we said that DONuT established that an invisible particle interacted with the tau, and NOMAD, Chorus, and E531 established that that particle was not the electron neutrino or muon neutrino. But really, DONuT was not the first to do this. Other experiments also established this. What was different about DONuT was that DONuT was the first experiment to register the tau neutrino in a particle detector. In tau decay and the decay of a W to a tau and a neutrino, the neutrino is not detected. It shows up as missing energy and momentum. And the Z invisible width was measured by looking at visible Z decays. What DONuT was the first to do was to directly detect the tau neutrino, not infer its existence from the observations of momenta of other particles. But previous experiments had clinched its existence. So, did DONuT discover the tau neutrino? This is not something we say often in particle physics, but arguably it's a matter of opinion. Just to be clear, the new tau has most definitely been discovered. But the question is, by whom? Let's look at one more point. DONuT's result didn't reach the 5 sigma discovery threshold commonly used in particle physics. Their significance was around 3 to 4 sigma. Is this bad? I would say not really. Let's briefly take a look at the 5 sigma criterion. In particle physics, we do an awful lot of measurements. Discoveries are rare. 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 statistical fluctuations are much more common than discoveries. If we get a result that looks merely unusual, we assume it's more likely to be a statistical fluctuation than a true sign of new physics. For this reason, it is typical in particle physics to declare discovery only if the result, in the absence of new physics, would be exceedingly rare. But in the case of DONuT, the pre-existing experimental evidence had essentially already clinched the existence of the tau neutrino. So it makes sense to take the idea of a statistical fluctuation as an explanation for the DONuT result less seriously. Accepting a less stringent statistical significance as still compelling is reasonable in this case. Or, to put it another way, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And normally, discoveries are extraordinary. But given the preponderance of pre-existing experimental evidence, the claim of the existence of the tau neutrino in 2001 was not particularly extraordinary. So, did DONuT discover the tau neutrino? I'll let you decide.